Fertilization in flowering plants. The male gametes are contained in the pollen grain produced by the anther. So here's the structure of the pollen grain. There is the outer protective wall known as the axine, which is thick to protect the plant, the pollen grain from damage. And then below the axine, there's a thin inner wall known as the antine. Within the walls, there are pores known as the germination pores, and enclosed by the walls is the cytoplasm, within which there are two nuclei, the generative nucleus and the tube nucleus. So the pollen grain is not the male gamete, but is a structure that carries the male gametes, as we shall see. While on the other hand, the female gamete is carried in the embryo sac. The embryo sac is contained within the ovule of the flower. The female part of the flower is known as the carpel, consisting of the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Now within the ovary, we have one or more ovules. Each ovule contains the structure known as the embryo sac. Within the embryo sac, there are nuclei and cells. 6 cells, 3 antipodal cells, 1 egg cell, 2 synergids. Synergids and antipodal cells are non-functional eggs. Well, there's only 1 functional egg and 2 naked, that is unenclosed nuclei known as the polar nuclei. So these make up the embryo sac that is contained within the ovule, and then the ovule is contained within the ovary. The ovary make part of the carpel. The carpel is the female part of the flower that makes up the gynoecium. So again, embryo sac is not the female gamete, but is a structure that contains the female gametes in the form of the egg cell. Now we look at how the process of fertilization takes place in flowering plants. Now, the process begins with pollination. Recall, pollination is a process by which the pollen grain gets transferred onto the stigma of the flower. Upon landing on the stigma, a sugary liquid is secreted by the stigma. This sugary liquid also contains nutrients. It is absorbed by the pollen grain. The sugary liquid also stimulates the pollen grains to germinate, thereby producing an extension known as the pollen tube. So the pollen grain germinates to produce a tube that grows into the style. This pollen tube carries in it the tube nucleus that is present at the tip and the generative nucleus that immediately after entering the pollen tube divides by mitosis to produce 2 male gametes or male nuclei. The pollen tube pushes between the loosely packed cells of the style as it grows down toward the ovary, with the tube nucleus at the tip. You can see here the pollen tube grows down through the style, the tube nucleus is at the tip, and then the male gametes, the 2 male gametes, follow closely behind. So the role of the tube nucleus is to control the growth of the pollen tube. That's why the tube nucleus is located at the tip. Now, the two male gametes or nuclei are the functional male gametes. The tube nucleus role is to direct and control the development of the pollen tube. The style provides the nutrients for the growth of the pollen tube towards the ovary. Now, the tube continues to grow down the style. Now, once it re-enters the ovary, it enters the ovule through the micropyle. So here the tube nucleus grows down style and into the ovary and then into the ovule. Now, once it gets to the ovule, it enters through an opening known as the micropyle. That is the micropyle. So usually many pollen tubes grow down the style simultaneously, but usually it's only one pollen tube that will penetrate. Once the pollen tube comes into contact with the embryo sac, this tip would burst. That is, the pollen tube will grow down the style, and once it comes into contact with the embryo sac, remember it enters the ovule through the micropyle, and once it comes into contact with the embryo sac, this is the embryo sac, the tip ruptures and the tube nucleus disintegrates, thereby forming a clear pathway through which the two male gametes will enter the embryo sac. Now, one of the male gametes fuses with the egg cell to form a diploid zygote, while the second male gamete will fuse with the two polar nuclei to form a primary endosperm nucleus, which is triploid. So from the tube, one male gamete will fuse with the egg cell to produce a diploid zygote. Then the other male gamete will fuse with the two polar nuclei to form the triploid nucleus, which forms the primary endosperm nucleus. So the primary endosperm nucleus will later develop into the endosperm, while the diploid zygote will develop into the embryo. These two fertilizations or two fusions, that is the first one between one male nucleus and the egg cell to produce the zygote, diploid zygote. The second one, the fusion of the second male gamete and the two polar nuclei to produce the triploid nucleus, that is the primary endosperm nucleus, constitute what is known as the double fertilization. Double fertilization is peculiar to flowering plants, whereby there are two fusions, one between the male gamete and the egg cell to produce the diploid zygote, the second one between the male gamete and the polar nuclei to produce the primary endosperm nucleus. So this double fertilization occurs only in flowering plants.